The rudder and daggerboard for the sailing kit come all machined like you see here, but the first step is to install an epoxy trailing edge all the way from the bottom tip and up to the top of where the foil is shaped. And it's on both the rudder and the daggerboard. And this is done very much like I did it on the skeg, with a little taped edge. There's 3 layers of tape on each side, leaving a gap between. These are pressed down tight to the plywood. And then that gap is filled with epoxy here. It's a little hard to see at the moment. This tape overhangs the trailing edge by about 1/4 inch. Ultimately, it wants to be 3/16 of an inch of solid epoxy. So there's a little extra here that'll get sanded down. The rudder gets filled up a little past where the shaping begins, but otherwise it's the same as the daggerboard. And then on these bottom edges, these tips, it's taped only on one side, and I just put in plenty of extra epoxy there to shape it down later. And also filled these pinholes up at the top. And those will get sanded flush and drilled out again later. After an overnight cure, I pulled the tape on these foils to reveal the epoxy edge that it left behind. And I found when I pulled the tape, I was using a scraper to get some of the residue off, like this over here. Tape leaves a residue on the epoxy. It actually chipped the new epoxy in a couple places, so I filled it in with this pink colored epoxy here, just to fill those chips in before I sanded it. The first day I untaped it, they weren't ready to sand. The epoxy was still way too soft and gummy. So it's been a couple more days now, and I can get this sanded and start the next steps on these foils. I started the final foils prep by sanding the epoxy trailing edge to 3/16 of an inch in width. That's what it's designed to be. And once I'd done that, then I sanded it flush and smooth according to this milled in shape here. So I used a sanding block and just sanded till this was nice and smooth all the way along. And I hand sanded this area here where there's a curve that leads up into the unmodified top part of the daggerboard here. The trailing edge is square. It's not rounded. And then down here at the tip, where I had to fill as well, I just shaped it according to the contours of the piece here. It's pretty self-explanatory with a sanding block and by hand. This is slightly rounded because it ties in with the leading edge, which is round, or at least curved. At the top of the case, I rounded over with a router and sanded this all smooth. This whole board has been sanded to 120 grit to prepare for fiberglass. It came out well, I think. Nice and straight. And I did the same thing on the rudder. The main difference being that the rudder's trailing edge has a bit of a curve to it. It's very subtle, but it's there. And then at the top, the epoxy had to fare in smoothly to the upper part of the case here. So I had extended the epoxy up quite a bit, and I sanded it down till it was flush and fared in smoothly. And again, these curved areas I just sanded by hand. Same 3/16 of an inch on the trailing edge here, and roughly on the tip. And it's smooth and sanded on both sides, 120 grit, ready for fiberglass. Before glassing these foils on one side, I laid out some plastic, and I quickly traced each piece on here just so I'd have a reference for putting in these nails to help hold it up off the surface. They're just little 1-inch nails. I cut the heads off. They're a little over 1 inch in from the edge. And that's just to hold this thing up so that I can glass it without any problems with the glass draping over and running into the table. So I did that for both the rudder and the daggerboard, and these are all ready to glass now. The foils get fiberglassed one side at a time, and here's the first side. The cloth hangs deliberately over this leading edge by quite a bit. That kind of helps it drape naturally over the curve and helps hold it there. There's another step in between doing the layers to help reinforce this area, and you'll see that in due course. Trailing edge doesn't overhang much, but it's wet out right to the edge of that epoxy tip that I put on there. And then the top part here, you can just see right there, there's a second reinforcing layer over the top, and both of these top layers wrap around over that rounded edge on the plywood and down basically to the other rounded edge. And then when the second side gets glassed, it'll overlap this a little bit, so there will be complete coverage. And then it transitions to this flat area. It's the same on the rudder, except there's no reinforcement at the top edge. But otherwise, the process is just the same. Quite a bit of cloth draping over this leading edge. And then the cloth hangs over the thicker part here, over the round over, and around to this transition to the trailing edge. It's one layer of 4-ounce cloth. The fiberglass on the first side of the foils drapes over the leading edge like this. It just kind of, I wet it out roughly to the center of this curved leading edge, and then the cloth draped over and sort of held it there. And so what that leaves us is this sort of void right in here. And the book calls for filling this with a little bead of thickened epoxy. So that's going to be the next step here on both the rudder and the daggerboard. I used a syringe to pipe in this bead of thickened epoxy here along the leading edge, where the cloth from the first side of the daggerboard overlaps the leading edge. There's a little void there, and this epoxy fills that void all the way down to the tip. I piped it in and smoothed it out a little bit with my finger, got rid of some excess because I felt like there was a little too much in there. When the top side is, or the side that's facing down now, is fill coated later and that cures, then I'll be trimming this glass and doing a little sanding and shaping on this epoxy leading edge, so I didn't want any extra in there that didn't have to be. This is the daggerboard, and I did the same thing on the rudder right here. Again, it's just this little bit right in here. It's kind of an odd step that I'm not going to pretend I totally understand, but I think it'll be more clear as I go along, as most things that I don't understand in this build have become. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean I'm not going to do it. With the two foils turned back over now, you can see this little bit of thickened epoxy from the other side, right along there. And it starts to make a little more sense because you can see, at least I can see, how it continues the curvature of this leading edge around. So it's basically helping form a new leading edge without having to glass over the sharp curve here. Same thing on this rudder. You can just see the epoxy in there through the cloth, and it does fill the void right where that cloth sort of starts to fall off the edge of the rudder itself. So now I'm going to fill coat the first side of the daggerboard and the rudder. After I filled that leading edge with epoxy from the back side, I gloss coated the first side that I glassed. Nice heavy gloss coat. because I want to be able to sand and smooth this rudder without going through to the glass. And on the Daggerboard here, there's also a slight seam right there where there's a second layer that covers this top part. So I wanted to get that nice and coated. All the weave is filled. You can see the nice gloss on it. Same thing on the rudder. Well, the rudder doesn't have extra reinforcement. So when this cures, then I can turn these over, trim the glass, do a little sanding and shaping at this forward edge, and then glass the second side and fill coat it as well. I trimmed the excess fiberglass from the first side of the Daggerboard and rudder, and now I have them inverted so the bare side is facing up. I'm going to have to do a little work here on this leading edge where that little epoxy bead is installed. And I'll also clean up the edge where I trimmed the fiberglass around this top part. And then down the trailing edge. That part will be simple. Forming the proper shape at the leading edge where this kind of mess is will take a little more time, but shouldn't be too difficult. Same thing on the rudder. With a block sander and then by hand, I beveled this leading edge, this little epoxy bead leading edge. I put some tape on the plywood here so that I wouldn't sand into the plywood. Then I used a block sander at an angle to bevel this so that it basically continues this curve. There's a little curve at the leading edge here, and that new epoxy just sort of continues that around. And I finished up by hand. So this is the net result of that little epoxy bead that I put in on the first side. Now the glass for the second side is going to cover this. And it'll create a very hard epoxy edge here at the forward leading edge of the foils. So that's what that accomplishes after all that. Just like we did on the trailing edge, except this one is rounded, not flat like this. And other than that, I just had to lightly sand to get rid of the residue of where I trimmed the fiberglass along the trailing edge. And then around these upper portions, I sanded again at an angle so that I could smooth the top edge of that fiberglass without cutting into the wood here. So that just smoothed that top edge enough so that the glass from the second side can go right over this all the way around. And the rudder is the same. Here's the rudder. Little epoxy bead at the leading edge, shaped the same way as on the Daggerboard. And then otherwise I just cleaned up the trimmed fiberglass around the edges, just like on the Daggerboard, and all the way around this top part. This is the sheathing on the second side of the rudder and Daggerboard. This happens to be the starboard side of both pieces. Same as the first side, one layer of 4-ounce cloth. The Daggerboard has a second layer starting here, covering that top section. And up here at the top, the fabric wraps over the edge all the way down to where the leading edge starts, and around the other side to the beginning of the trailing edge. At the leading edge here, the glass drapes over this epoxy edge that you can just see in there. And I've made sure to kind of push it in there. I've even been pushing the glass kind of underneath so that it covers that whole edge without a problem, and it's stuck very well. There's no issue there. And then the rudder is the same, except there's no further reinforcement at the top. Just one layer of 4-ounce cloth. Again, drape this down over the leading edge as much as I could. And then the layer wraps around the whole top And this overlaps the layer from the first side, the port side, that also draped over. So when I trim this excess off, there's going to be essentially 2 layers on that whole edge grain. Other than that, there was nothing noteworthy about doing the second side. And that's it for now. Later in the day, about 5 hours after the fiberglass went on, things had cured enough that I could come down and do the fill coat. Old news, these fill coats. Just a good heavy roll of epoxy over the fiberglass to leave enough on there to fill the weave of the cloth. Doesn't take a ton on 4-ounce cloth. I did go on the heavy side just so there's plenty to sand. Get these foils nice and smooth. They are hydrofoils after all, and we want to keep them at the right contours. And again, on this Daggerboard, we've got a seam. I guess it's good. I can barely see it. There it is right there, where there's that second piece of cloth. So I made sure to roll a good heavy layer across that as well to help me ease that in when I sand this. So that's the fill coat. The rudder and Daggerboard are now completely glassed, and I've spent a little bit of time sanding the fill coat on both foils. It's nice and smooth and evenly dull, I guess. Looks good. Everything's nice and fair. And these are ready for a final gloss coat of epoxy. I did check the fit of the Daggerboard in the trunk. This is a photo of it. And the rudder is also sanded similarly to 120 grit, ready for a gloss coat of epoxy on both sides. I'll do one side at a time. So here's the first side. A few minutes later, and the gloss coat is applied. I applied it with a roller, tipped it with a foam brush, one side at a time. Then when this side cures, I'll do the other side tomorrow. And on the next day, with the gloss coat on the first side cured, I flipped them over and applied a gloss coat to the second side. This is the last finish on these for now. Again, just rolled on and tipped out. This completes the work required on these 2 foils. I'll cover the connections at the top ends of the rudder and the Daggerboard elsewhere.